Hello, it's Michael here again. So I thought today, actually, notice I'm in the yurt again. And for those of I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion here. For those of you on Patreon, or following me, or supporting me on Patreon, this is what you get at the Imperium level, which is a 2-night stay. I mean, besides all the other stuff, you get 2-night stay in the yurt. So, and it's beautiful, and it's in the middle of the woods, not far from my house, and it's gorgeous. So maybe one day I'll do a video of just walking around out here. But anyway, thus ends our commercial. God, sometimes I hate myself. But anyway, I wanted to talk today about Rosicrucianism. Because I am giving a course on Rosicrucianism, an online course, which begins in the middle of October. And it's an online thing. I think it's on Fridays. You'll see in the description, you'll see a link to it in case you're interested. But even if you're not interested, you'd probably be interested, I have to say, if you're interested in the idea of Rosicrucianism. Now, I have been interested in this idea of Rosicrucianism since I was very young. The first time I heard the word Rosicrucian, I just thought it was, it just kind of captivated me. I didn't know what it meant. But Rosicrucian, the rosy cross, I mean, that's kind of a beautiful poetic image, right? Or sometimes they call it the golden and rosy cross. And I love this image. I love this idea. But I didn't know a darn thing about it. And I wandered into an occult bookstore when I was probably 21. And the proprietor, whoever it was, clerk, said, well, what can I help you find? I said, well, I'm interested in Rosicrucians. Do you know anything books about that? And he gave me probably, which was not a good book to give you. I mean, not that it's not a good book, but it was not a good book to start off about learning about Rosicrucianism, because it was Rudolf Steiner's lectures called Rosicrucian Esotericism, which is kind of the deep end of the pool, and you've never been exposed to this stuff before. So I got that book. It was no help. I mean, later I grew to really love Rudolf Steiner, but at that time I was like, I have no idea what this guy's talking about, and I have no idea what Rosicrucianism is. So eventually, I think I got Arthur Edward Waite's book, The Real History of the Rosicrucians, which was very helpful. A lot of people like to rip on Arthur Edward Waite, but people owe him a debt of gratitude. It was such a dogged and dedicated scholar. He must have spent, who knows how many hours in the British Museum looking up manuscripts and books and, doing this research, because this stuff just wasn't out there. He kind of put it on the map, at least in English-speaking circles. Nevertheless, I was still interested in. It was in groups in my 20s, probably close to 30, study groups on the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which was an interesting group, because half the people were anthroposophists and the other half were like Western magic people, people interested in like Dan Fortune and stuff like that. And they did not get along. They did not get along. But I thought it was a really fruitful study, because the Chemical Wedding, if you've read it, is bizarre. It's like a DMT trip. It's acid, right? it's psychedelic as all get out. So it's hard to unpack exactly what is going on in that book. And so it was nice to try to figure out what was in there with a group of relatively intelligent people. But still, I ended up still puzzled about the whole process. Eventually, in my journey, when I went to graduate school, and then I finished my master's degree, and waited a while before I pursued a PhD. But then I was pursuing a PhD in English literature, and I chose. I was interested in the encounter with God that people, try to give utterance to in whether it's prose or poetry, whatever happens to be. There's this fly, and I'm going to try to kill it. People had the door open. I got it. I may have got it. But anyway, I was interested in that, and I chose people to do in my dissertation, which was later published as Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England. That boring title. I think my original title in my dissertation was Hallowed Ground, and the title is the subtitle. Anyway, so I chose people in my dissertation like John Dee and his encounters with so-called angels or spirits, but also John Donne, the metaphysical poet, in his use of negative theology. Then I also did a bit on Sir Kenelm Digby, interesting figure in history, but alchemist, member of the Royal Society, kind of a Catholic apologist as well, which is a strange combination in England in those days. Here's that fly. And so in fact I owe him a great debt of gratitude for, in his book The Closet of Sir Kenelm Digby Knigget opened, he has 110 recipes for mead, metheglin, and melomels, which is my favorite hobby, is making mead and stuff like that. So I love that guy. And he also had curious kinds of mystical experiences, we can call them, very many of them having to do with his recently deceased wife. Then I wrote a chapter on, because I always wanted to know more about, so all these figures, I just wanted to know their story. So there's no better way to learn the story of these various figures than reading everything they've written and almost everything that was written about them, which is how you roll when you're a doctor. And so the next chapter was on Thomas and Henry Vaughan, and I entitled the chapter "The Rosicrucian Mysticism of Henry and Thomas Vaughan," because I discovered, after years of contemplating this kind of idea of Rosicrucianism, I saw, and especially Henry's poetry, but then I was able to read Thomas's prose through the lens of Henry's poetry, and they were identical twins, interestingly enough. And Henry was a Paracelsian physician, or Hermetic physician, as was his brother, but his brother was also an Anglican priest at the time. This is at the time of the English Civil Wars. But I realized when I read them that what they were espousing was a kind of spirituality that I have pursued for my whole life, and it's not very esoteric at all. Well, people will call it that, but it's not. It's not esoteric. It's very practical, very commonsensical, and this is, I think, has lots to do, lots in harmony and resonance with sophiology. So anyway, so that's what I was. And actually, the last chapter, if you want to know, was about Jane Ledd of the Philadelphian Society, who was the Philadelphian Society, where they were called Behmenists. They were deeply influenced by Jakob Böhme, and to a degree, so were Vaughan. Both the Vaughan brothers. They were deeply influenced by Jakob Böhme, as well as Paracelsus, as well as the Rosicrucianism of the early part of their century. And I want to talk about that just for a second. So what we have, and this is kind of a crazy thing that happened in the beginning of the 16th century. And you'll see that these things often happen when censorship is kind of lax. Because the kings and whatever, they like to keep a tight rein on whatever kind of information was getting out. But during the English Civil Wars, publishing in esoteric topics or spirituality, or we can call it alt religion, kind of mushroomed, because no one was there to watch the store. And the same thing was true in England, actually. Not in Germany. Because in Germany, there was not one, you had various tiny governing bodies and duchies and kingdoms, but they were all really small, almost like Greek city-states. And so it was much harder to keep a lid on that, too. and so interestingly enough, so in 1614, this uh, short document, I mean, short, you can call it a book, but it's not very long, called the Fama Fraternitatis, or the fame of the brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, showed up. And soon afterwards, the Confessio Fraternitatis in 1615 came out. The confession of the brotherhood of the Rosy Cross comes out. And these two documents, when they dropped, it was like Taylor Swift dropped in the record. Now it was just, it created they call it the Rosicrucian furor. It just blew that lid off of Europe. I mean, all the intellectuals in Europe are kind of lost their marbles because they want to know who these guys were, the secret fraternity of brotherhood, they're working to restore Christendom in a modern sensibility, right? So people went kind of gaga about this, and even Rene Descartes went to great pains to try to contact them to become part of the club, which is kind of funny because Thomas Vaughan later had a pretty dismissive attitude of Descartes, as do I, and Vaughan dismissed his ideas as whimsies. He just had no respect for this guy at all, and but anyway, nevertheless, Rene Descartes out there trying to find the Rosicrucians, and nobody found them. Nobody found them. Michael Meyer, who was deeply influenced by these documents as well, he was a court physician at the for Emperor Rudolph in Bavaria. Or, it was at the time Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, or whatever it is now. And he couldn't find him either. But he wrote all these really wonderful, interesting alchemical tracts, very symbolic. I mean, I kind of got interested in that aspect of it in my late teens, early 20s, because I was interested in engraving and printmaking and things like this. And I love those Rosicrucian and alchemical emblems are just so enigmatic and so strange. Just strange, but I loved them, you know. And also, you also see the same thing in the emblems that were created for the works of Jakob Burma, which, you know, are likewise enigmatic and mystical and really alluring in that way because you don't know what they mean, which is, you know, part of the fun. But anyway, so those two documents came out and blew their lid off of Europe. Then in the following year, sometimes some say 1616, some say 1617, the book known as The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz comes out. And that's the one that, as I mentioned earlier, is like an acid trip. It's so surreal. It is so out there, but it's also extraordinarily funny. It makes fun of the entire enterprise of occultism, even though occultism, you know, occultists throughout the years have not gotten the joke at all. And I think Umberto Eco, if you know him, his book Foucault's Pendulum, which I think is a fantastic book. I tried to read some other books of his that couldn't get through, but Foucault's Pendulum I think is a masterpiece. And the whole idea of Foucault's Pendulum, and this is what we saw happen with the early Rosicrucian documents. And Foucault's Pendulum, these publishers invent the secret society, and they publish some works by this secret society. Then all these occultists go, "Oh yeah, I must be a member of that," and they all form this whole secret society about this thing these guys just made up, and it's kind of a exercise in how preposterous this kind of vanity that runs. I mean, if you meet occultists, I mean, megalomania runs rampant through that realm. I mean, that's not everybody, sure, certainly. I know a lot of people who would call themselves occultists or esotericists who are not megalomaniacs at all, but that even Valentin Tomberg talks about that in Meditations on the Tarot. It's rampant, right? We have secret knowledge, and you don't, right? Which always turned me off. I have to say. So, but this is likewise, I think, happened through the course of the life of this idea of the Rosicrucians. So you've seen ever since those 17th century documents showed up, and after the silence that followed. So there's this big announcement, this renovation of the world, and then nothing happens. There's no follow up. Those three books come out and nothing else from from the same sources. Um, and actually, those books are attributed, and we know for, I could say for 98% fact, that the Chemical Wedding was written by Johann Valentin Andre, who was well, I don't know if he wrote it when he was probably wrote at least the first draft when he was a college student, but later he became a Lutheran pastor. But his family was really interested in alchemy. Um, so he was probably behind, or he was behind the Chemical Wedding, and he was probably behind the other two documents as well, and at least one of them. But I think both. And but he called it much later when people talked to him about it. He called it a ludibrium, or a joke, or a game, you could say, right? Because if you read the Chemical Wedding, it's like an extended look at these flies. It's an extended like a magical, like a wonder box of wonders. I mean, there's all these jokes and stuff in there that if you take him at his word that it is a joke, you can see how funny it is. But if you're like a serious occultist and you're looking for secrets, you're not going to find secrets. You're gonna find a lot of red herrings and blind alleys, because that's what he made it for, right? It's a fun house. It's a fun house. And nevertheless, after as Michael Meyer wrote in his book Silentium Post Clamores, the silence after the clamor, um, nothing happened. And so, and this is my take on it, that you had, as in Foucault's pendulum, you had all these people who assumed, okay, I must be a Rosicrucian, I'm part of the club. And they started, and especially at late, when you get to the 18th and 19th centuries, you got all these guys running around assuming they're Rosicrucians. You see this in particular with the Golden Dawn, which I don't see any Rosicrucianism in the Golden Dawn at all. But they assume they are, because, and this is what I found. Now, I may have talked about this before. So when I was teaching college during COVID, right, when they sent us home in 2020, and then at 2021, I think the first semester we had to spend in masks. Right, it was the fall of 2020, and we're in masks. And the funny thing is so I'm talking to these students every day. They only see the bottom half of their faces, but then, and I couldn't learn their names. But after a while, I would be going across the campus, and I'd see students without their mask on, and I'd see the bottom half of their face, and I'd realize that my imagination and my brain had filled in the bottom part of the face without my really giving it any energy to do so. But I realized in every case I was so wrong about what the bottom part of their faces looked like. And I think this is what happened with the Rosicrucians not showing up, because they don't show up and show their faces. These various occultists and writers filled in the faces for them. They filled it in, and they projected in a way you could say it becomes a kind of idol, where they project their own sensibilities and hopes and aspirations onto this idea of the Rosicrucian, right? Now, that is not to say that I don't think there were any Rosicrucians. I think, and this is what I see in Henry and Thomas Vaughan, and I also see it in Robert Flood, their a little bit older contemporary, who was one of the first apologists in England of the Rosicrucians. And I also see it in Michael Meyer, and there are other places you see it, and you can see the influence in all of them, especially of Paracelsus, but also especially with the later figures like the Vaughans, the influence of Jakob Burma, who was also to a degree influenced by Paracelsus. So what you see in them is the sensibility that they are well, it's kind of an interesting thing. They're rejecting the kind of Cartesian separation of spirit and body, or matter and spirit, that was coming to be the vogue in what we can call scientific research, or natural philosophy, as they would have said in those days. And so they're rejecting that, but that doesn't mean they're not interested in science, right? And I think you could say that they were kind of proto-Goethean scientists. They wanted to maintain what was good about the scientific, or we call it natural philosophic traditions they had inherited. For instance, that the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, they didn't want to let that go, because they knew it was true, right? And most of them were practicing astrologers, and so they had what they could call empirical proof that it worked. So they knew that, and they knew that God speaks to us through two books: the book of Scripture and the book of nature, right? And this is what I saw in Henry Vaughan's writing that was so appealing to me. And then that's what I realized, that was what Rosicrucian mysticism is. And you see it also in Robert Flood, though his books are harder to come by, and they're usually in Latin. And I don't think any of them, except for Mosaical philosophy, has been translated. And that'd be a drag, maybe a huge job to translate his books. And they're accompanied with all these sumptuous, enigmatic engravings from what's his name, the Debris, or whatever they were. I can't remember. I'm losing it right now. But this great engraving company in the Netherlands, and his books are full of them. I mean, they must have been expensive books when they were out. In fact, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I think it was a German, could have been a Dutch publisher, put out a facsimile edition of Flood's book, Utriusque Cosmi Historia, etc., which I think was going for something like $1,500. It's ridiculously expensive, but it had to be that expensive because it was that expensive to produce. And even in Flood's day. In fact, here's a little side. When I was starting graduate school in the 2000, they didn't have Google Books. So, and the only one of Flood's books within 500 miles was at the University of Michigan Rare Book Room. I would go visit. It was like visiting somebody in prison. And, how much Latin reading and translating can you do in a couple of hours? What basically, it's like visiting somebody in the joint, and there's the guard, the librarian's watching you, like, don't touch it with the pen. You got to give them your license. You can't have a pen. So yeah, that's fun. So I'll just read you a couple lines from Henry Vaughan's poem, The Tempest, right? All things here show him heaven, waters that fall, chide and fly up, mists of corruptest foam quit their first beds and mount. Trees, herbs, flowers, all strive upward still and point him the way home. So and he says in his poem, in Rules and Lessons, to heighten thy devotions and keep low all mutinous thoughts, what business ere thou hast, observe God in his works. Here fountains flow, birds sing, beasts feed, fish leap and the earth stands fast. Above our restless motions running lights, vast circling azure, giddy clouds, days, nights. Really? So this is the key for me when I discovered this. And this, to me, is what a Rosicrucian, call it mysticism, or approach to understanding the world is. It's an approach that is simultaneously mindful of God and God's working in the universe, and you can say Scripture, because if you read Vaughan's poetry, he's often has an epigraph from Scripture on his poems, or even the titles allude to it. Like for instance, or the first line of cock crowing, is Father of Lights, which is a quote from First James 17 or James 1:17. Um, so yeah, and so that was really appealing. But if you read the documents themselves, the Fama and the Confessio, we can hold off on the chemical wedding and all of its craziness. In the Fama, they describe the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz, which much later William Butler Yeats would talk about. But here's what he says, right? Furthermore, the Fama describes CRC's tomb as inscribed with affirmations of Christian piety. Round about the first circle or brim stood Jesu mihi omnia, which is Jesus everything to me. In the middle were four figures enclosed in circles whose circumscription was nequamquam vacuum, which means by no means a vacuum, means nature bores a vacuum. Legis jugum, which is the yoke of the law. Libertas evangelii, which is the liberty of the gospel. And de gloria intacta. And you could interpret de gloria intacta as the unspoiled glory of God. But if you know your sophiology, intacta also means virgin. So, and I take this to mean the virgin glory of God, because there is an inherent sophiology in this Rosicrucian documents. And in fact, in some of the Rosicrucian documents, you'll see at the top. You see this in Robert Flood as well. At the top of creation, kind of that we could call it the metaxu, the between creation and the Creator, is usually the Virgin Sophia. You see this in Flood. You see it in I can't remember the name of the book. There's it'll come to me, but you see it very often show up in these documents where the Virgin Sophia is the metaxu, or the between God's order and the created order, which is only natural because if you know the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 8, right, it's Sophia, or wisdom, is assisting God at the creation. I was with him at the beginning, before all things, right? So this is important, and this is why, I would certainly still describe my kind of spirituality as this kind of Rosicrucian spirituality. In fact, I just said cock crowing. There's actually a cock crowing outside. I can hear it from here. See, there are no accidents, people. There are no accidents at all. But anyway, but here's what the thing is. If you go through the history of people who call themselves Rosicrucians, you have some that are more Christian. You have some that are not Christian. I would say the Golden Dawn is not very Christian in general. But on the other hand, Rudolf Steiner, you see a kind of, at least in times, he's not as straightforward as people try to present him, but there is something in Rudolf Steiner which, is interested in the spiritualization of matter, right? And bridging those two worlds of spirit and matter. And you see, if you know Waldorf education at all, or biodynamic farming, or biodynamic beekeeping, there is a reverence for nature in Steiner's approach to science that you do not see in the hard sciences as we have inherited them. And you also see it in Goethe, and I think Goethe's scientific method, of delicate empiricism, or reverence, is a great example of what the Rosicrucians were after. They did not want to. You can see this in the 17th century in particular. The debates about science. So the people of the scientific revolution would speak of nature as a woman, which is kind of standard poetical language to speak of nature. But then when they spoke of nature as a woman, they spoke in terms of rape or torture, right? Which is why Goethe called their method the empirical mechanical dogmatic torture chamber, right? You torture nature to make her give up her secrets. You find this all over the place in the literature of the age. In fact, two people who write about this in a very informative way are Mary Midgley and Pierre Hadot, two actually contemporaries, who write beautifully about this and compellingly. So if you're interested, I would check those guys out. And so this is why, people say, do the Rosicrucians still exist? Not in like this unbroken line of secret society. Absolutely not, in my opinion. Right? I've never met one, and not that that doesn't mean anything. You know, but you see, there are people out there through history who are trying to maintain that, I guess we can call it the simultaneous awareness of the Sophianic shining through nature and the reality of Christ, right? Right. So it's very incarnational spirituality, and so, but the thing is, if things are unspoken or left unspoken, it invites other people to fill in the blanks, and that's a lot of what we've seen. I understand it, and I can't remember how it exactly goes, but there were apparently some on the Georgia Guidestones. There was some inscription from CRC, meaning Christian Rosenkreutz, which is baloney. I mean, I know it was there, but I don't think it has anything to do with Rosicrucianism. Rosicrucianism, in my read, is about as traditional a Christian approach to things as you can have, because it has much more in common with medieval approaches to natural science than it does to, because of its acknowledgement of the realm of the spirit, than it does to modern methods of science, of investigation, of torturing nature to give up her secrets. And I often think, what do you think would have happened had all that brain power, all that investment in time and resources and finances gone into this kind of science?